It was a moment most people would have crumbled under. A challenge from a figure of authority who wielded years of experience and a courtroom full of spectators. The judge, with his air of superiority, thought he had the upper hand. But in the blink of an eye, Karoline Leavitt, a woman who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, flipped the script. What followed was not just a courtroom victory, but a masterclass in wit, turning a supposedly routine legal battle into an unforgettable spectacle that left the judge, and everyone else in the room, speechless. The judge, a seasoned veteran with a reputation for dismissing those who dared challenge him, leaned back in his chair with a smug smile. His voice, dripping with condescension, echoed through the courtroom as he pointed a finger at Karoline. "I'll give you a chance to speak, Miss Leavitt," he sneered. "But I warn you, don't make this worse for yourself." Karoline didn't flinch. Her eyes never left his, calm and calculating, as though she had anticipated this very moment. The room held its breath as she rose from her seat, her posture straight and unwavering. She wasn't just defending a case. She was about to teach this arrogant judge a lesson he'd never forget. "You know, Judge," she began, her voice steady and laced with a humor that no one expected. "I've heard people say that experience is the best teacher, but sometimes it's the student who teaches the teacher a lesson." The judge's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "What are you implying?" he snapped. "Oh, nothing," Karoline replied, flashing him a smile that was more dangerous than friendly. "Just that, for someone who's been on the bench for decades, you sure don't seem to understand the meaning of fairness, or perhaps the importance of humility." A collective gasp swept through the room. The judge's face turned red, his hands clenched into fists, but Karoline wasn't finished. "You see, when you hold all the power," she continued, "it's easy to forget that the people you judge are human too. But don't worry, Judge," she added, her tone light but laced with razor-sharp precision. "I'll remind you." The courtroom was silent. Everyone knew this was no ordinary confrontation. Karoline wasn't just speaking her mind. She was dismantling the judge's very persona, piece by piece, with the precision of a surgeon. But just when the judge was about to speak, she delivered the final blow. "You've been in this position so long, you've forgotten what it's like to lose. Maybe it's time you learned," she said, her voice ringing with an almost mocking sweetness. The judge, now visibly flustered, slammed his gavel down. "Order," he shouted. "This is not a place for jokes." Karoline, unshaken, leaned in slightly and said with a grin, "Oh, don't worry, Judge. The only joke here is the idea that you could ever intimidate me." The room was stunned. What was supposed to be a moment of humiliation for Karoline had turned into a humiliating defeat for the judge. One that had everyone wondering. Had Karoline just flipped the entire courtroom on its head? And if so, what would happen next? The judge, still red-faced and gripping his gavel, struggled to maintain control of the situation. The courtroom, once a place of tense silence, had erupted into a low murmur. Karoline's words had struck a nerve, and now everyone, lawyers, spectators, even the stenographer, was watching the judge to see how he would respond. For a long moment he said nothing. His chest heaved as he tried to regain composure, but it was clear that the moment of superiority he had once enjoyed had slipped through his fingers. But Karoline, unbothered by his silence, didn't miss a beat. "You know," she said, her voice still light, but with a sharpness that no one could ignore, "I think it's time we get back to the matter at hand. After all, we're here for justice, aren't we?" The judge's hand trembled as he lifted the gavel again. "This is not your stage, Miss Leavitt," he barked. "I will not tolerate this insolence." Of course you won't, Karoline replied, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. Because tolerating things you don't understand has never been your strong suit. Has it? At that, the room went dead quiet. Karoline had done it again. She'd pushed him to the edge, daring him to make the next move. And everyone could feel it, the judge was no longer in control. There was a long pause before he spoke again, and this time, his voice was quieter, more measured, as if he was trying to regain some authority. "You've made your point, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice strained. "But this is a court of law, not a comedy club." "Oh, don't worry, Judge," Karoline replied, smiling sweetly. "I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to remind you what it means to be fair." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The judge, once so certain of his position, was now backing away from his initial challenge, trying to regain his composure in the face of Karoline's sharp, unrelenting humor. The courtroom watched in suspense, wondering what Karoline would do next. She had already proven she wasn't intimidated by the judge's authority, and the question on everyone's mind was this: would she finish him off with one final, decisive blow, or would the judge somehow find a way to claw back his dignity? As the seconds stretched on, it was clear that no one could predict what would happen next. But one thing was certain: the game had changed, and Karoline Leavitt was in control. The tension in the room grew thick, the silence almost unbearable as both Karoline and the judge locked eyes. The onlookers could feel the weight of the moment. The battle wasn't just about the case anymore. It was a fight for respect, and Karoline had already claimed the upper hand. The judge, his knuckles still white around the gavel, tried one last attempt at regaining control. "Miss Leavitt," he began, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound authoritative. "You've crossed a line. You will apologize immediately for your disrespect, or I will hold you in contempt." Karoline didn't even blink. She crossed her arms, leaning slightly forward, her expression now colder than ever. "Apologize?" she asked, her voice low but powerful. "For speaking the truth? For exposing your hypocrisy?" "No, Judge. I won't apologize for that." She took a step forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "But let me make something very clear. It's not just me you've insulted. It's every person who has ever come through this courtroom expecting fairness, expecting justice, only to be met with your arrogance." The judge opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped, his pride and authority crumbling under the weight of Karoline's words. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for either a sudden explosion or an end to the madness. Karoline, however, was done playing games. She took a deep breath and stood up straight, her voice cutting through the air with a finality that left no room for argument. "I came here today not to humiliate you, Judge," she said, her tone steady and resolute, "but to remind you that power is nothing without integrity, and you've lost both." There was a pause, then a single soft sound, the judge's gavel striking the desk with a resounding thud. The courtroom, now eerily silent, waited for his response. But instead of more harsh words or a threatened verdict, the judge simply stood there, his face a mixture of frustration and defeat. He had been outwitted, outmatched, and there was no coming back from it. Slowly, he turned to face the rest of the courtroom, his voice now barely above a whisper. "The case is dismissed." And with that, it was over. Karoline stood there, unwavering, a slight smile playing at the corners of her lips as she watched the judge fumble with his words. She hadn't just won the case. She had won the courtroom, the respect of everyone who had witnessed her mastery, and most importantly, she had dismantled an arrogant figure of authority who'd thought he could never be toppled. As she gathered her papers and turned to leave, one of the attorneys who had been watching from the back of the room approached her with a look of admiration. "Miss Leavitt," he said with a grin, "that was incredible. You didn't just defeat him, you destroyed him." Karoline smiled, her eyes gleaming with both triumph and humor. "Sometimes," she said, "you have to remind people that arrogance has a very short shelf life." The doors of the courtroom swung open as she stepped outside into the light, a sense of victory in her step. It wasn't just a legal win. It was a reminder that, no matter how powerful the opponent, the truth, with a little humor and a lot of guts, could still reign supreme.